Yeah. Like I suppose that brings on to, which is the next point, which is intensity. So that's what you've been discussing. It's kind of like, what's the intensity at? Okay, so exercise selection or activities or whatever, like there's differences in terms of how you would program things, how you would select things depending on your goal. But the intensity level, like for most people recreationally, like you probably don't need to go to the absolute death with your workout program. Like you don't need to go to failure. You don't need to go to failure to get results, full stop, right? Obviously it helps to know where failure is, which means that you have to, approach that at the very least, get within a rep of that, the very least at some stage, so you know what that's like. But for the vast majority of people, you don't actually need to go to failure per se. For the vast majority of people, you're probably going to be working and getting the best results at kind of 2 to 3 reps from failure for the majority of your sets. Now, say you're doing 3 sets of an exercise, maybe that last set, you've got one rep left in the tank. But those first 1 to 2 sets, you're probably doing 2 to 3 reps left in the tank, right? Like you're not going like a gun to your head, can you get a fucking another rep, right? You're not going all out, right? Now, if you are doing a sporting activity and you're trying to use, lifting, training, whatever, to increase your either your total in like powerlifting or just increase your training capacity, and especially if you do have a very limited window, like say for example you have an off season, your off season is like 12 weeks long. There's going to be times during that time period where you have to get closer to failure, right? If you were powerlifting and you never lift limit weights, you never get up to heavier weights because you're always kind of like, oh, I want to leave some in the tank. At a certain point, you kind of have to see how hard you can rally the car. You can't just leave, gas in the tank, right? So that's a little bit of a difference between someone that's just training for general health, general improvement, versus someone who's training for a sporting improvement. And that's not always the case. For example, martial arts, I don't really see a need for you to, be maxing out or getting your volume up, which we'll talk about in a second, getting your volume up to really, really high levels, because it's probably only going to detract from your actual like martial art training, because you're going to be fatigued. And that's probably the biggest, thing that you need is the skill acquisition versus like the physical attributes. Like, yeah, okay, if you're very, very weak, and you are just losing matches or whatever because you don't have the physical strength or the physical like capacity or whatever, like, yeah, we probably need to focus more on the physical stuff. But for the vast majority of people, it's going to be the technical stuff that they need to focus on. So I don't really see the need to be going to the absolute highest intensity, the highest volumes, etc. in those individuals. However, if you are trying to peak for a powerlifting meet, like we probably do want to build up intensity over time. We probably do want to know what at least the first rep you're going to do, maybe the second attempt, we probably do want to know what those are going to be. So we probably want to have lifted close to that or somewhere around that at some stage throughout the training block, right? And it's the same with stuff like bodybuilding, and it's a little bit more evident with the volume discussion, which we'll talk about in a second. But even with intensity, like at some stages, you probably do want to get a little bit closer to failure, like you need to kind of push the envelope if you are trying to, build your physique to the absolute biggest you can be. So that is a little bit of a difference than someone that's just training for general health, general improvements, right? If you are training to be the best at your sport, you probably do need to, and especially if your sport is like a strength sport or whatever, you probably do need to occasionally go to those higher intensity levels. And I don't just mean percentage of 1RM, I mean like proximity to failure, right? But if you're just a general, enthusiast, you probably don't need to go there as often. Again, periodically, it can be nice because you know what you're capable of, how to gauge 2 to 3 reps away from that point in future. But for the general population, I'm not really going to be recommending let's go to 100% every single set, every single day. It just doesn't really make the most sense. And this is especially true for stuff like CrossFit, where it's like, oh, well, we just want to set the timer and we want to go for max reps. Like if you're literally doing that as if someone has a gun to your child's head, like you're probably not going to recover. Fatigue management is not going to be great. And throughout the week, because you're literally blowing your load every time you go into the gym. You're literally having a near death experience. It's not great for overall fatigue management. But do you have anything to say that on that, Gary, in terms of intensity, and I mean proximity to failure with intensity, or I suppose just like the overall effort given? Do you have anything else to say on that?
Yeah, I think just quickly that, like, obviously we've touched on it many times, the fact that the closer you go to failure, the more fatigue you're going to experience from that, of course. But there's also the kind of the other obvious but often left unspoken part of that, which is that the closer you are to failure, the higher the risk of technical mess up or error too. Like, for example, if you're doing your final rep in a bench press and you push up more with the left side than the right, then there's a non-zero risk that the bar kind of slips to the side and falls down in your chest. There's also the non-zero risk that as you push more to one side, that one side becomes far more overloaded and increases your risk of injury disproportionate to just looking at the RPE. And that, that's especially the case on certain exercises that you will see people go to failure on, like, for example, like sled leg presses or hack squats, where the weight is literally down on top of you. Like, you see people go to failure where they can't even perform the concentric without a spotter, and they're left, someone running across the gym to help them out of it. Like, that's just absolutely unnecessary risk to be taking in the gym. I completely understand it because I've done it, especially when I was younger. As I said, not a very risk averse person. So that type of training like gives me a good kick. And that was always what I was drawn to. But from the perspective of considering your health and even what's best practice really for your results too, it makes no sense really to be taking sets like that all the way to failure. As a rule of thumb, like, the safer the exercise is and the lower risk of catastrophic injury, the cooler I am with someone taking it to failure. If you are doing a machine chest press and you fail concentrically, okay, you just put the weight down, or same on a lat pull down. It's not a big deal at all. But if it's an overhead press or a jerk or anything where there's a risk of the weight landing on you, clearly that's not as good an idea.
Yeah, and that actually just goes back to exercise selection in terms of like, if you're choosing risky exercises in general and you don't need to be doing that, and then you're also layering on like higher proximity or closer proximity to failure, like, you're going to have a bad time regardless of who you are. Now, that might be required for your sport. If you're a power lifter and you have to at some stage get close to a max bench press, and if you're training alone, like, that's a riskier endeavor, but it's your sport, and maybe the risk to reward ratio is favorable for that for you. But if you're just a general population trying to improve your body composition, improve your health, do you need to be benching to your max on that day when you have no spotter, no help in the gym, or you're training at home? Probably not. Same with bodybuilding. Like, if you're like, oh, I'm going to have to go to failure today, and you're like, my shoulders are feeling a bit off, like, going to failure and picking a riskier exercise, like, I know, a bench press or something, you're only one rep away from ripping your fucking pec off your sternum or your upper arm. So, like, why would you take that risk in that session and then ruin your entire, like, quote unquote bodybuilding career? Like, maybe it's not ruined, but you know what I mean? Like, you've now got a substantial injury that's putting you out for a couple of months, all because you wanted to take a riskier exercise to failure. The risk to reward is just not there for the vast majority of people. And like Gary said, like, the two of us, we're pretty non-risk averse, so we would probably do stuff like that, especially as we were younger and stupider. I would like to think we've matured a little bit, but you know what I mean? Like, for some individuals, you're going to take that risk to reward and go, yeah, that's a favorable risk to reward ratio, when in reality it probably isn't. You're probably not getting as much. Like, I know stuff that I've done, like squatting, literally close to failure, like, 5 rep maxes with, like, fucking 200 kilos on my back, and I'm like, I am not built to squat. All that was doing was contributing to fatigue of my fucking spine and potentially snap city. Especially because, like, my ass sticks out so much when I'm squatting that there's no way for me to successfully squat or fail a squat and dump the bar backwards. If I do that, it's definitely landing on my spine because of the way my body is put together. So I have to dump the bar forward. So it's a very risky maneuver if I fail a squat. Like I have to dump it over my head, you know? So for me, what the fuck was I doing? Like, why was I doing that? You know? But I did it, you know? So you have to factor in, it's like, okay, well, for some people, you're going to take that risk to reward ratio and, you know, call it good and be like, yeah, it's fantastic. But it's, again, like Gary said, survivorship bias. I can say that because I got away with it, but I don't know what the repercussions are down the line. You know, maybe it's going to be a fact that I'm like, oh, I actually have degenerative disc issues or degenerative like hip issues or whatever because of all that training that I did, you know, that I didn't necessarily need to do. And like, you might look back on that and you might be like Ronnie Coleman and he's whatever front squatting 800 pounds and his only regret is not doing 3 reps, even though right now he's in a fucking wheelchair, you know. Like realistically, that's probably more related to the fact that he has never eaten a vegetable in his life rather than the training he did. Like I would probably contribute that to more of the risk factor for what he's experiencing right now, than the actual training. But still, the risk to reward ratio, maybe it wasn't favorable for him, even though he's looking back at it now and going, yeah, I wish I did more, you know? So yeah, do you have anything else to say on that, young Gary?
No, that's all good.
Fantastic, right? So also with this and related to intensity is the discussion of volume. And if you are training for a specific sport, especially if you want to be the best at that sport, you're probably going to have to do higher training volumes. But if you're just someone that's looking for general health or general just improvement of yourself, like there's no reason to be training 8 times per week, 12 times per week, 20 times per week, right? If you're a competitive athlete, you're going to have to do the amount of volume that it requires for you to get better, right? That might require 3 training sessions a day, you know? So again, that is one area that people fail to realize, and they try to copy what other people are doing and not actually, first of all, copy the recovery things that those other people are doing, hint, hint, drugs, but then try to do the same training volume. And it's just not going to be effective because they don't have the same recovery capacity, the same stress management, fatigue management, whatever. And they're also not aiming for the end goal, the same end goal. Now, does that mean that you don't push training volume? No, not at all. But you need to be more aware of like what's actually going to lead to the best results for you in this moment. Is it going to be doing more, you know, exercise or training sessions per week? Is it going to be doing more volume? Like, is 3 sets enough for your goals versus 5 sets? Are you going to always be at the like 20 to 30 sets per muscle group per week, or would you get better results by doing like less, you know, 10 sets or something, you know? And so we have to look at that overall volume. And that doesn't mean that, you know, at certain stages, especially if you're looking for, you know, physique improvement or maybe bodybuilding or whatever, you know, there's going to be times where your volume does creep up a little bit, creeps up a bit beyond your recovery capacity. But for the vast majority of people, you shouldn't really be staying at those higher volume thresholds. You know, again, sport, it's a different story. There's going to be time periods where you need to creep it up higher. You might need to sustain it higher for a longer period of time. But for the vast majority of people listening to this, you could probably get away with doing way less. And this is a little thought experiment for you to do when you're looking at your program design. Like if I said to you, you have to do the least amount of training that you could possibly do to still get the same results that you're doing, what would you change in your training program? Would you train less days? Would you, you know, train less exercises? Would you, like, what would you do if you're still trying to get the exact same or similar results? Because that should, you know, help you understand that all the stuff you do is not necessarily required. So there is obviously somewhere in this kind of minimum effective dose to maximum effective dose. And most people, you know, tend to at least stay, you know, closer to the maximum effective dose, and they never get down to the minimum effective dose. But it's important to know where that minimum effective dose is, because there's going to be periods of time in your life where, you know, stress is higher, you know, workload is higher, you know, you're not going to have as much time to get to the gym, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to need to reduce training volume in general. So if you don't know how to do that and all you think is, oh, well, I need to be at, you know, 12 sessions per week to get results, like you're going to be up a fucking creek without a paddle, you know? So that is something to consider. Do you have anything to say on volume, Gary?
I guess just note it just on your final point there in terms of the minimum effective dose. Like, I think when you begin to go through a period of time where you genuinely are forced to reduce your training volume, you actually learn that that level, or at least the maintenance volume level, is a lot lower than you'd expect. Even for me, that's something I've probably learned in the last 2 years, like since doing like obviously the pandemic and everything, but also being more into jiu-jitsu than weight training for longer periods of time. You know, cut my training volume so much lower than I ever would have in the past, and have been quite surprised at being able to more or less kind of maintain my strength, like improve it in some cases, but even go back from periods of time where I've only been training twice a week in the gym and still notice that my strength has maintained and that my performance across multiple sets has maintained. So that's been something that's been surprising for me. And I think something that most people report, like the vast majority of people will report that their level required for maintenance is so much lower than they would expect. And that can sometimes tell you that maybe you are doing a bit too much. Like, are you wasting a load of time in the gym? If you can maintain at 2 days per week, but you're training 6 days per week and you're doing like 30 sets a session, like, are you sure all of that is high quality and actually needs to be done? Because again, I would argue that independent of injury risk and things like that, there is some degree of a trade-off in other areas of your life. If you're spending 2 hours a day, 6 days a week in the gym and not getting additional results from it, because if you've got a surplus, let's say, of 5 hours that you could cut off that and still get the same results, then that 5 hours could probably be spent on something that would be far better for your relationships or for your kids or for your career or your nutrition, if you were able to cook nicer meals or whatever, enjoyment of life. And they're all positive things too. So I think that's something important to reflect on, because I find that with our clients, or my clients at least, that uh, it's very often the case that they can get away with less than they think when they start to, be efficient with the quality of their work.
Yeah, 100%. And again, like this is something that you do learn once you are kind of forced to do less.